Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Matt Tyndall. He's coming from ConsenSys and building insurance systems and insurance platform at ConsenSys, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Everybody, my name is Matt Tyndall. I'm the lead developer on the insurance team at ConsenSys. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about what we've been working on and kind of where we're at and where the industry is at. Talking about going beyond the proof of concept and building a platform, blockchain platform for the insurance industry. So just to start off, we're at the Decentralized Insurance Conference. And I stole this from a different presentation at ConsenSys, but the idea here is that the digital economy is heading for decentralization. I'm sure you're familiar with all these different companies, but starting off with the PayPal and the Facebook, very centralized, but brand new businesses that have exponentially grown. Later on, you started seeing the sharing economy emerge. You have Uber and Airbnb and these different platforms that are still centralized, but able to provide sort of this new marketplace for different things. And what we're heading into in the P2P economy, which obviously started with Bitcoin and now with Ethereum, where we can build some really interesting things on top of it. But I just wanted to kind of show that to preface sort of the conversation. And so just before I get started, how many people here are developers? Okay, so there's a good number here. So if you're not familiar with these are sort of the key concepts behind blockchain and behind the platforms and the tools that we're building. Cryptographic integrity, distributed ledger, smart contracts, and tokenization. And so these are sort of the building blocks of all the things that we can create. And I'm just going to quickly kind of talk a little bit about ConsenSys and who we are and what we're doing and sort of what led us to this spot here. This diagram kind of shows an overall picture of the different parts that make up ConsenSys. We are ultimately a venture production studio. We're working across many different industries and many different things, building everything from the infrastructure layer out to the applications. And we have a number of different sort of segments that represent that stuff. The infrastructure layer, these are people that are working on the Ethereum protocol, working on different clients, working on Quorum, JP Morgan client, that type of stuff. We have ConsenSys Capital, which is one of our newest groups, which is related to token services and crypto asset management. And we just started a $50 million venture capital fund. And James Lazas, who's out in the audience there, is the head of that group. So if you're interested in talking about that, he's here. But then really we get into the enterprise and the product side. And so we've been working in a number of different industries with a number of different organizations, building different products for them on the blockchain and working with different governments and working with different organizations to kind of educate them as well as build real production systems based on Ethereum. And so the project that I'm here to talk to you about is called iChassis, and it's our insurance product, and it sort of exists in this product area up here, iChassis. Mm-hmm. This diagram here also just sort of illustrates a little bit better sort of the different verticals that we're working on at ConsenSys. I mentioned that at the protocol level, we have our protocol engineering. We have Infuro, which is sort of like a Amazon web service for hosting Ethereum nodes. Different developer tools, Truffle, Nethereum, which is an SDK for .NET. And then some of the core components that you may have used or heard of. We have Alethio, which is an analytics platform. MetaMask, which is sort of the browser extension for interacting with Ethereum. Uport, which is our identity platform. And then at the application layer, that's where we have some of the actual applications that we're working on. Supply chain, Balance, which is an accounting tool. Gnosis started off with ConsenSys. Now they're pretty much their own powerhouse of cool stuff that they're building. But this just sort of shows an overall diagram of some of the stuff that we're working on. I'm just going to skip over these slides. It just talks a little bit about Truffle, the developer tool, and Uport, which is our identity platform. But what I really want to get into is related to insurance and sort of what we've been working on and how we got here and some of the things that we've learned along the way. So ultimately, we've been involved in the insurance space for a little over a year now, helping to educate companies and experiment with the blockchain. It's been through a number of different proof of concepts that we've developed for companies, different speaking engagements and being involved in consortiums. And really what we've seen is a lot of the experimentation stage, where companies are interested, they've heard of blockchain, they want to do something with it or build something with it, but they might not have the expertise or they might not know exactly what it is that they want to build. And so the last point there, what we've been seeing in the industry is a lot of the wait and see, where different organizations aren't necessarily ready to jump out and to really build a production system on it. And ultimately, a lot of the proof of concepts that we've been working on end up sort of being toys on a shelf where they're really awesome for an educational use, but they don't actually end up getting used in any type of real capacity. And so that sort of led us to this project called iChassis. And ultimately, this is a platform that we're working on for the insurance industry. The vision for this platform is that it's an autonomous public utility that can be governed by the participants within the industry. And so if you look at some of the other projects in the space, this is sort of different in the sense that we're ultimately trying to build something for the industry to use, and it's not something that we necessarily want to fully control or own or have any organization really own. We want to be able to build a system of smart contracts that can exist out there for multiple organizations and companies to use and to build on. And so what iChassis is really a multi-tenant policy origination and risk tokenization platform. And I'll unpack that a little bit as I go through this. So there's a couple of different objectives of iChassis. We want to create a common base protocol for policy origination and policy lifecycle. We want to create risk tokenization and transfer mechanism. And we want to build it so it's future-proof, so that it's extensible and upgradable, and it's something where we can continue to build upon and we can update contracts and we can change the way that it works as we learn more about the industry and how it operates. And ultimately, we want it to be maintained and governed by the community. This isn't something that we at ConsenSys want to fully own. We are the technology experts, and we have the expertise to build these type of things, but ultimately we are not the insurance industry, and we look to others to help to leverage their expertise in the space. And so the goals of this platform are really to help for an organization to help lower administrative and processing costs, to gain a number of internal efficiencies from the use of smart contracts, to provide increased transparency in the industry, to create a collaborative ecosystem where organizations can leverage technology so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, and ultimately to expand the investor base for risk acquisition. And so with the ability to have these policies exist on the blockchain, we can then tokenize the risk associated with those policies and in turn have reinsurers or different investors purchase that risk. And so I just want to start by talking a little bit about a smart contract-based policy and what that looks like. In a smart contract policy, we have a common standard for the industry. We have an immutable ledger where there's a single source of truth. And since it's a smart contract, we can do a number of interesting things related to that, like being able to record the history of events that have transpired within that policy, and to reduce friction amongst interacting with that policy, and as well as some of the additional improvements related to claims processing. This slide sort of shows a little bit more of the idea behind the anatomy of really what a policy is in iChassis. And I kind of talked about a few of these things, but I'll highlight, for example, in claims processing, we're really trying to create a flexible process where a policy can be, a claim can be submitted through a traditional, manual type of intervention, but be extensible in the sense that you can use oracles and some really interesting new blockchain-based technologies to interact with a policy. Working with a number of insurance companies, privacy and security are obviously high up on the list. And so being able to have both public and private data within this shared ecosystem is a real challenge, but also one of the big advantages that having this type of a platform can provide. And so I'm going to get into a little bit of talking about kind of the contract system. So not going to get too technical, but just kind of giving an overall picture of how some of these contracts work and why we've sort of designed it this way. But ultimately, as I mentioned, we're really building a collaborative ecosystem, and we want to have multiple organizations coexist within this ecosystem so that they can leverage a number of the benefits of that. And so if you look at this diagram, what Matan was talking about with the DAO and a lot of those different ideas, a lot of that is sort of along the same lines of thinking that we've been thinking of trying to design this architecture. And so at the top, you essentially have some type of a controller contract that isn't owned by any one individual. It could be owned and governed by the industry. So there's no real owner to that level. And below that, it can control different registries that represent different aspects of the platform. And so if you look here, we have an organization registry, which is essentially a contract that keeps track of all the different participants within this platform. So you have insurers and brokers and reinsurers and investors, and they can all be represented within this contract. We have a core registry that sort of represents all of the core contracts. These are the protocol for defining what is a policy, how do I create a new policy, how does a claim work. All of these things exist within this core registry. The idea being that all of the contracts that exist within these registries are upgradable and can be modified by different parties. So the core registry, for example, the contracts in there can only be changed or modified by the chassis controller. And in doing so, it provides sort of this level of access control that's really important for a system like this. And so the last piece over here is the application registry. And this is where we really start to kind of get the idea of the ecosystem, in the sense that if we have defined sort of this protocol for what a policy is and what a claim is, these are sort of building blocks that can be leveraged by different applications that exist as smart contracts within this system. So, for example, a lot of the proof of concepts that we've been seeing in the industry related to proof of insurance or parametric insurance applications can be represented as contracts within this application registry. And these could be built by really anybody. So it could be different insurance companies, it could be different insurtechs, it could be startups, developers, whoever. And they could basically create these applications that are submitted to this application registry that then other organizations can use and leverage. And so some of the other activities related to the platform, like the governance aspect, can be existing within those applications as well. And so since all of the participants in this exist within this organization registry, they can interact with these applications. And ultimately, when I've been talking about risk and the tokenization of that, which I'll get to in a second, this is also where you can start to see different marketplaces for buying and selling of risk on this platform. And this diagram shows sort of a different perspective of the same ideals here. So at the bottom, you see our iChassis platform is sort of the protocol level. Different organizations exist on top of that, and they can issue and create policies that sort of exist all within this same blockchain platform. And then applications can be created and used by the different organizations within there. So you can see in this example, there's a proof of insurance application, and both organization A and B are utilizing it, and they can do so in a secure way where they're able to leverage that technology, but not necessarily allow other organizations to see what's going on through that application. And so this just sort of highlights a couple of the efficiencies that exist from this type of a platform. From the basics of just smart contract-based efficiencies, having policies that allow for semi-automated claims processing and some of these different applications that I mentioned, to the ability to have fraud protection and monitoring. So since there's various policies from different organizations existing within this platform, you can have applications that, for example, let's say for the example of like auto insurance, if multiple organizations have policies, they may have like a VIN number that is exposed to the entire platform, and they can then basically detect when a double claim is filed or something like that. And then we have simplification of compliance and regulatory. So from that aspect, being able to sort of selectively disclose different aspects of the system to different agencies. And then jumping into the tokenization of risk, which is sort of what I'm going to talk about next. And so the idea here is that when you issue a policy, there's going to be a certain amount of risk associated with that. And by having a policy that exists as a smart contract, you then have a path for turning that into a digital asset and being able to do different things with that. And so tokenization enables the separation, repackaging, and trading of very granular units of risk. It allows for enhanced and automated underwriting. You can create access to previously uninsurable risks. And it improves the capital efficiency and the liquidity of this risk. And so in this diagram here, it sort of shows that an insurer issues a policy, they transfer that risk to a reinsurer, and that reinsurer then can either keep that risk, he can sell that to an additional reinsurer or to capital market. And all of this happens through this tokenization process. Slide highlights a couple of additional benefits. Ultimately, you have more data, more transparency, and less friction in risk transference. And I think I mentioned all of these previously, but transferring and selling risk efficiently, having more types of investors and products, and ultimately, it's just a more efficient process. And so this is one other example of sort of the tokenization aspect, and this is specifically with catastrophe insurance. And so this is sort of a new thing that wouldn't necessarily be possible through the existing systems, where we have a hurricane protection policy that's issued by an insurer. The risk that's associated with that is tokenized and transferred to an additional reinsurer. And that's where you can do some really interesting things. So since you have this digital token that represents this risk, you can essentially have, let's say you have a pension fund, a low-risk pension fund that wants to invest in and have a part of that risk. They can hold that for, let's say, the month of December, which is traditionally a low-risk month for hurricanes, and then at the same time, you can have a high-risk hedge fund who purchases that for the bad months in the July, and so this is something that isn't necessarily possible given the tools that we have today, but is enabled by blockchain-based smart contracts. And so let me just check on how I'm doing for time here. Doing good, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this works from like the contract perspective, and as I showed you before, this is sort of the hierarchy of we have this chassis controller contract that sort of owns these other registries, but I'm going to kind of go into more detail about how those different things work. So I mentioned the organization registry being where all of the different organizations within this platform exist. And so if you're an organization and you join the iChassis platform, then basically the system will create a contract called an organization controller that essentially is your organization's representation within the platform. And that organization controller is owned by you in the sense that when you create this, or when you join iChassis, the private key that's used to sort of submit that your organization to the platform becomes the sole owner of that organization controller contract. And so you can have multiple different organizations all within the platform represented by their own contracts. In the same sense, you have this core registry, which I mentioned has the real core protocols of where the policy contract exists, where the claim contract exists, and these are contracts that are utilized by all of the different organizations within the platform. And then same thing with the application registry, where this is where you could have the proof of insurance contract or the different contracts that are related to these application level apps that leverage the core contracts that organizations can choose to interact with. And so what I was showing before was sort of the overall picture from the chassis controller's perspective or from the platform's perspective. This is a perspective from an organization. So if you're an organization and you join iChassis, this is sort of your entry point here in this organization controller. And if you're a primary insurer, then you're going to have a policy controller, and that policy controller essentially keeps track of all the different policies that you've issued and the various states of those policies, and allows you to create new policies. Talking a little bit about kind of what a policy is, and this is really the core of the entire platform. It sort of relies on what a policy is and the different abilities that a policy has. And so these are some technical things, I guess, but ultimately a policy is being represented as a smart contract, and we're creating a generic interface basically to allow for multiple different types of insurance policies and multiple different organizations to be able to do that. And so there's some very basic elements that are represented within this contract, but not all of the business logic will exist within this contract. This is really sort of just the blockchain-based aspect of what that policy is. And so it contains public and private attributes, can be made up of different coverages. Policy moves through various stages as it is issued, and the quotation and claims and all these different processes happen. I mentioned before that we have sort of an event history of the policy, so every time one of these changes takes place or any event happens with that policy, it's sort of recorded so that you can have the provenance of that policy visible to investors, and as the risk tokenization aspect happens, being able to kind of see what is this policy that I'm investing in? Is this a good investment? Is this risky? And ultimately, a policy has the ability to issue and revoke risk tokens. And so I just wanted to sort of put this up there in the sense that we are really trying to define a protocol for a policy. And if you're familiar with the ERC20 token protocol, which is what Ethereum uses for tokens, this is all the ERC20 standard is. It's 10 lines of code, and all these are sort of very generic functions that represent the ability to transfer token from one to another. And so you can imagine the same type of thing for a policy. There's different aspects of a policy, submitting a claim, moving through the various stages. These are sort of the things that can be created into a protocol that can be leveraged by a number of different organizations. And so that sort of leads me to sort of what's next and where we're at. Essentially what we're trying to do is form an iChassis working group. And so if you are interested in helping to define sort of what that protocol is, then we invite you to be a part of that and to join us. essentially we're going to be having some meetings where we talk about the development process or progress of iChassis, help to validate some of our assumptions with different industry people, and as well as provide a hands-on education and being able to open up our code and show our code. We're doing this very much in not trying to be secretive and trying to do this out with being able to leverage as many resources as we can. And this is completely free to be a part of and to join. And then this is sort of our roadmap of where we are and where we're going. Ultimately, like I said, we see iChassis as this autonomous public utility, but we see the governance of it being something that we want as many organizations as possible to be involved with. And so there's a couple of different mechanics that we're looking at and working through to determine sort of how that works. But being able to leverage some type of a token sale to, for example, grant governance tokens to different organizations, as well as from the perspective of if you're an insurtech or a startup and you want to build on this platform, being able to allow you to have a process for monetizing that application that you're building and you're providing to different organizations through some type of a utility token. We're working on the contracts for this right now. We're looking to release an MVP in Q1 of next year. And we should have a demo in the next month or so, kind of showing how this works and how an organization would be able to interact with this and work with it. But yeah, if you have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to any of us. As I mentioned, James is out in the audience, so if you have a question, you can talk to him, and I'm here as well, and we'll be here for the next week. So if you see us at DevCon and you want to talk, let us know. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Very impressive talk. Great that you are sharing what you're doing. So we feel honored to have you. Anyone in the audience, questions, please?
I can see the framework being used in consortium blockchains. And maybe I missed, but do you see a role for the public chain?
So yeah, so that's a good question. I didn't explicitly mention it, but right now we're building on Quorum, which is the permissioned blockchain. We're doing that because it does have some benefits from privacy and working with large insurance organizations. That's something that they're deeply concerned with. Personally, being able to work on Quorum provides us a roadmap to the public Ethereum network, and ultimately, I want to see this type of application exist on the public network. But I think that, as we hear more about kind of where some of the private transactions and ZK snarks and stuff like that are within the next week, I think that we're going to hear a couple of things. I'm very, excited to see where that is and sort of when that can be leveraged for the public utility.
Fine. We have one more question.
Hi, is this a generic solution or are you targeting a specific insurance sector?
So what we're really trying to do is sort of build the underlying protocol that can work across many different insurance types. You see a lot of applications related to parametric insurance right now, and I think that that's really the low-hanging fruit in the sense that you are able to do a lot of things. It's very compatible with smart contracts and being able to leverage oracles and different things like that to sort of process claims. But ultimately, we'd like to see all sorts of insurance products on this, and so we're not targeting directly one or another right now.
Any more questions? Yes.
With all the opportunity for securitization and breaking things down into many little pieces and remixing it, one of your points was you said it would, with this technology now, potentially reduce ambiguity and provide more clarity into what you're purchasing, but certainly with the ability to combine tens or millions of different products into a single asset for sale, how might you then reduce that complexity and re-represent it to a potential purchaser or issuer?
So that's a good point. So from that aspect of it, one of the key thoughts behind this is we want to really have more transparency as to sort of what has a policy been through, what is the associated risk with this policy, and oh, that's my timer. Being able to basically have sort of this provenance of the history of a policy and being able to provide that to to reinsurers and to investors so that they have a better idea of sort of what it is that they're purchasing. I think that that's one of the issues that we have right now is you don't have a really good idea of what the risk is associated with a policy. It's just something that you can purchase, and I think that this provides an additional layer of transparency there.
Does this answer your question?
I mean, sort of. I mean, certainly it provides something that we didn't have access to before, potentially a reference and a way to work backwards through to see where all those initial products were, but it still doesn't necessarily make it easier. I mean, now that there's 10 billion lines of code, Microsoft opened up, it's an Excel source code, it doesn't make it any easier for me to understand necessarily how something is going to work or the origination of a particular securitized product.
So I guess I would say, at what level are you trying to gain an understanding from?
Meaning, at some point, to sell a product, you're going to have to put it on a PowerPoint in a very simple fashion, but there's nothing simple about these potential products once they've been passed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's a challenge that we have, in the blockchain space in general, and it's something that is definitely true for this, but also true for a number of these different smart contract-based applications and tools. And I think ultimately that's going to come as more people are educated and sort of can start to understand what this is. That's really, I would say, our job in trying to better explain that and to try to break that down, because ultimately the insurance industry is complicated and there's a lot of business processes that are convoluted and confusing, and really one of the things that our goal here is to sort of define what some of those things are at a protocol level, so that you have a better understanding, so that if you are working with one organization and you go to a different organization, they can sort of understand the same underlying processes for how to interact with a policy. And I think that that's sort of one of our goals as well, is really to provide sort of a better idea of how these things work. Yeah.
So I have another question. The success of such a platform, which I think makes total sense for the insurance industry, stands and falls with the adoption of the participants in the ecosystem. So this platform comprises not only the main players, but also periphery like brokers and so forth. So if you want to make sure that this becomes a success, you need to convince every single aspect of that ecosystem. And I think that's the major challenge. You can develop a really good solution which completely follows the decentralized approach, but if you don't make sure that all the big incumbents at least look into that and try to adopt that, then it just doesn't work. So how do you want to do that?
And I think that is really one of our biggest challenges, and as we've been engaging with different companies, I would say that is sort of at the forefront of kind of what they are telling us, and sort of how, what we really need to look at and to try to figure out. I think that ultimately this is a platform that can be leveraged by sort of multiple different pieces within this process. And so, while we're coming at it from the perspective of having these big insurers to be onboarded in this platform, there's really nothing that's preventing some decentralized P2P type insurance player to also coexist within this platform. And so, it's possible that you can have sort of all these different smaller groups operating within here as well. But I agree, that is one of our biggest challenges. And in some ways, the insurance industry sort of needs to really take a look at this stuff, because there is a big threat of intermediation, and ultimately, if these companies want to remain relevant as we have these new insurance products growing, then they need to really take a look at this. And so we're sort of offering out a way for them to embrace this technology without having to sort of reinvent the wheel and build it from scratch, and be able to leverage that.
Okay, thank you so much. We have time for one more question. So then I would like to see this in the insurance working group of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. We talked about it. And Great. So we will definitely join the IHS chassis working group too.
Excellent.
Yeah, and maybe we can merge the efforts here in some form.
Absolutely, I think there's definitely some opportunities there for us. So,
Thank you so much, Matt. Please, another round of applause for Matt. Thank you so much.